Hi everyone. So this week is the last week before Easter, before you break up, all right? And the one that we're going to be looking at this week is the international responses and humanitarian intervention, all right? So if you already go to slide 2, we're going to be looking at what the aims and objectives are going to be from this session, all right? So what we're going to look at is the human rights reporting process, okay? The International Criminal Court, and the role of non-government organisations and humanitarian intervention. We're also going to look at the different pros and the cons of these different kinds of reporting methods in responding to human rights abuses and how they are taken by the countries that they're actually in aid of and people who may not support that. All right. I'm also going to look at the repercussions, as I've said, of these interventions into nation states. So actually, is this going to be a really positive impact that they're, providing, or is it a really negative impact? And we're also going to look at, is it actually very useful to look at other types of international responses? And we'll look at different case studies throughout this. Obviously, there's still video clips and stuff there as well, all right, which obviously we can't really play because of this. But please do watch them in your own time after you've obviously gone through this session, or just pause this video whilst I'm talking and then have a look at the clips whilst I'm speaking. So then it flows a lot nicer and it will make a lot more sense. Okay, so first of all, you know what I do normally give you tasks, normally kind of split the room into two. So what are the pros and cons of giving foreign aid to other countries? So the different kinds of foreign aid that there is, infrastructure, water, food, education, healthcare, all these different kinds of things. And this is provided by a lot of social actors. Now, what I mean by social actors are third-party organisations which tend to come in the form of charitable organisations. So you've got people like WaterAid, you've got people like the British Red Cross, you've got groups like UNICEF, Oxfam. So all these different people come together in order to provide different kinds of foreign aid to, majority of the time, it is developing countries. So that is one of the things that we need to consider as well. So in your own time, just make a little list of pros and cons, just so then that way you yourself understand what is foreign aid, what is the benefit of giving it, and what are the negatives of actually providing it to other countries, such as, is it going to go to waste? Is it actually going to get to foreign countries? The clothes that people are giving to Oxfam, are they actually of the right standard? Do they meet the criteria? And the same applies to food and that kind of thing. Is there enough to go around? So again, I just want you to question all these different kinds of things. Okay, so we'll move on to slide 4. So how does formal human rights reporting work? Okay, so there is something in place and it's called an international regime. This is basically a set of norms, rules, decision-making procedures, set principles in place that international social actors accept as very authoritative. So they're there in place. There's a lot of structures that they need to go through in order to provide things like foreign aid. And the global human rights is set on very strongly and widely accepted principles and norms, but they do have very weak mechanisms of international implementation. So that was said by Bayliss, Smith and Owens. Now the multilateral, so when I say multilateral, I'm referring to every single government is in consensus with this. So every single government would agree that the mechanism for implementing legal obligations should go through periodic reporting. So it needs to go in different stages, okay? Because if it all just came into one, we'd all get lost off. So if you do everything step by step, a little bit like drip feeding, it tends to help a little bit more because it smooths the process along. Now, they are sent to a public treaty body. Now, this treaty body looks at this report, it views it, and then what they do is they then make recommendations upon that nation state. So at the minute, you guys are doing a human rights report, okay? So let's just say that you are working, for the UN. You're forming this human rights report, and it might be because of trafficked embodied labour in sub-Saharan Africa, okay? So you're forming a human rights report. You're making down all the different recommendations and stuff that you think would be necessary. This would then go to a treaty body who would look at this report, they'd question it, and then they might make recommendations to that nation state. So this is kind of the way that it works. There's a process in place, okay? And this body, this treaty body, they can actually state specifically if there has been a violation of human rights or if there hasn't. Now, the Human Rights Council can monitor violations in quite a lot of substantial depth. Now, this monitoring is not done by this Human Rights Council, it's done by the states, so not independent experts. So it might not always be the best approach in the way that it's pushed forward, but it is still the way in which it's done. But also, I don't know about you guys, but for me, it makes me think, okay, so this is this developing country or another country that might not be developing, but it still has a lot of human rights abuses. Human Rights Council will look at these violations in depth, but the states themselves where this abuse is happening are the ones who's actually monitoring it. So it might be in their self-interests not to necessarily, monitor it correctly. But like I say, it just depends on this nation state who you're looking at. And actually, are they doing the right things by their civilians and by their people? Okay, so for example, Putin in Russia, yeah, obviously he has an obligation to his people and to the civilians of Russia. But is he really doing everything that he possibly can to protect the rights of LGBT people? Absolutely not. So these are some of the things that we can look at in depth as well. Okay, so if you go to slide 5, there's something called a multilateral approach. Now, more substantial work is done under the Human Rights Council's special procedures. They follow a very thematic approach. Now, when I say thematic approach, what I mean is, say for example, if you're conducting a piece of research for your third year undergraduate dissertation, okay, and you want to conduct a thematic approach or a thematic analysis, what you would do is you would be categorising very, very, very specific themes. So for me, I'm doing a master's dissertation and I'm doing a thematic stroke narrative analysis and an approach in the way that I'm actually doing my research. So what I want to do is I'm trying to do interviews with men who've been abused by their ex-partners in heterosexual opposite sex relationships, okay? Now, based on the responses that I get from my participants, they might say things like, oh, I was scared. So fear, that's one of your themes that comes from that. The second thing, she used me children as a tool against us and I was scared because of she used the children as a weapon. So children, that would be another theme. And then you could go on to something else. For an example, looking at it from a human rights standpoint, you could look at prostitution. That might be one theme that comes up. And then you might have drug addiction of the prostitutes because that's how they tend to keep them still, because they'll pay them money, but then they'll get them hooked on drugs and then they use the money to buy the drugs. And then again, drug addiction comes into play. So that could be another thing. So a thematic approach is basically picking out key different themes to look at in order to try and understand the problem and to really narrow it down to find a little bit of specificity. Okay. So in 2015, experts and working groups investigated 41 different topics, thematic mandates. So in 2015, the different themes that came up were the following: freedom of opinion and expression, privacy, Indigenous people, human rights defenders, slavery, and violence against women. So 6 different themes there, okay? Now, the countries examined were North Korea, Iran, Mali, Somalia, Sudan, and Syria. So again, these are all, not all developing countries, but these are countries which do have very tight restrictions with their civilians, okay? So this is the reason why this piece of research is being done, and the thematic approach was used to be able to pick out very, very specific human rights violations, which actually they need to look at in a lot more depth. But it does allow for a lot of public scrutiny, which reminds these different nation states of what their obligation is to their civilians and their citizens, and that draws a lot of attention, okay? So that will draw a lot of attention from not just their local press or their regional press, but from an international press point of view, okay? So that might draw attention from the UK, from the US, some other countries as well within Europe. So again, this is something that, other countries do get involved in this, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they get involved by trying to help these countries with the human rights abuses and their civilians and their citizens, but they will report on it, okay? So for an example, if you see the film Blood Diamond that I recommended last week, when we talked a little bit about child soldiers briefly, one of the things within that film, there is a woman who is a journalist and she is reporting on what the human rights abuses were and the poverty that a lot of people were enduring within Africa, and especially within the issues surrounding conflict diamonds, and how the jewellers in the UK had such a negative impact because they were using embodied traffic labour of black men to dig for diamonds, and these men were dying, and the diamonds came out as a product of that, which is why, again, people get involved to report this and make this not just a problem for them, but a problem for everybody, okay? So this is the reason why it happens, to make it everyone's problem, to make it everybody's concern, to try and do something about it. Now, I know quite a lot of you are law students, so there's something as well called the International Criminal Court. It was formed in 2002, and it has the judicial enforcement, well, the powers of judicial enforcement, but its mandate is restricted to war crimes and crimes against humanity, okay? Now, in 2015, or by 2015, it had initiated 23 cases in 8 countries, okay? And concluded 2 trials, only convicting 2 individuals. Now, that's not actually a lot on paper. You think 2 countries, 2 people? The International Criminal Court, wow, really? You think he's not going to be doing more than that? Especially when you're going to be, looking at only war crimes and crimes against humanity. Surely more is done here. Now, it's massively symbolic. Even though it's only 2 people, it's massively symbolic. And for these people who have been abused and the people who've been convicted for it, it really helps these people put their horrible, tragic past behind them. So a little bit like if a woman's been raped in the UK and she finally sees her abuser put behind bars, again, that in a way might help her put her past behind them. So it's a form of recovery. Okay. Now, the European Court of Human Rights has more teeth. Its legally binding procedures can enforce upon its members. So therefore, there's a lot more that they can do in comparison with the International Criminal Court. Okay. Now, if you go to slide 7, there's a clip called Burundi Leaves the ICC. Now, it's not that long, a few minutes long, maybe a bit longer. I want you to watch it. Please, 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 for the life of us, just watch it. And then you'll be able to understand maybe why they left the ICC, what impact this has on Burundi. Is it a positive impact? Is it a negative impact? How is it civilians being affected, etc.? Just make some notes, guys. It's really, really important that we go through this as best as possible, okay? Because I'm not there in person. We can't discuss it as a group. Normally these sessions are a lot more engaging, and right now I'm talking to a tablet and it's very, very different to what we're normally used to, okay? So please, please have a look at the clip, okay? So we'll go to slide 8, okay? So we are going to evaluate multilateralism. Now, when we looked at slide 3, when we talked about an international regime, how it's a set of principles, norms, values, that kind of thing, this international regime is based upon nation states actually implementing these human rights with modest international oversight. So it needs to be a very peaceful way that it's done. It can't be done, again, by more people dying. It can't be done by more people being abused. It can't be done in any other way than a very modest international oversight. Okay, so other people need to get involved. It needs to be watched over. It needs to be made sure that actually these human rights abuses are, in fact, getting rid of, basically. Now, enforcement misses this issue. So the human rights organisations, such as the HRC, they are there in order to facilitate that compliance. They are there to make sure that actually what's being put into place to try and stop these human rights abuses, to make preventative measures in place. The HRC are there. Well, that's just one of them, but they are there to make sure that all of these different procedures which have been put together are actually put into action. Okay, so whatever the action plan is, they're there to make sure that actually it gets put into place properly. Because if it doesn't, then it is going to end up in, human rights abuses continuing as far as the eye can see. But actually, it's a really positive thing, because this has a much more of an effect than we might actually think. It's not just, them physically being there in the flesh in these countries where it's happening. They've got things like critical discussions are going on within their nation states and their governments. It's become very politicised, all right. Reports are being put forward, and they're using that thematic approach to highlight how the abuses have had an effect, not just on the people, but on the economy, upon the nation state itself, on the fact that they may need foreign aid, the fact that they might not need it. It affects everything, okay? So it's just like a massive revolving circle. Now, most human rights abusive regimes try to hide or deny their involvement, and that is an impact of what multilateralism is, okay? Now, other nation states can influence or push other countries to improve the human rights, and we're going to look at an example of a case study in a minute. But just going back to that 4th point on that slide, when it says that most human rights abusive regimes even try to hide or deny their involvement, why is that? I want you to think why. Why do people not want to know that their involvement has been present? Why? I want you to think why. In fact, little assignment tip, and this is something that Drew has said to me a lot. but it's actually the best piece of advice I've ever been given. So you make a point, so what? So what? The best thing to do is always question, so what? So then you're developing and you're building and you're construction, and you're having a construction of an argument there. So you make a point, so what? Well, actually, because of this. So what? Well, yeah, because of this. And then your argument builds and builds, and it does end up getting stronger and stronger. And your ability to critically evaluate a piece of work or to form your own work strengthens massively. And it really, really gets you using and developing those skills that are definitely there. We just really, really need to make sure that, you're pushing them to your limits. Okay? So, on to China. Now, slide 8. There's a very, very famous picture there. Don't know if any of you know what it is, but I'll tell you anyway. Okay, this was the Tiananmen Square massacre. Basically, in 1989, tanks, massive army tanks, just like it is in slide 9, they rolled into Beijing's Tiananmen Square, and the Chinese government basically killed over 200 people, unarmed civilians. They weren't doing anything there other than a very peaceful protest. You can go back to slide 9 now, quickly look at that, and you can see the image of that person standing in front of the tanks. It was nothing more than a peaceful protest. He doesn't have a gun. He's very plain clothed. He's not in military uniform. So what you can see there straight away is that actually he's not doing anything. He's just making a peaceful stand in a protest. But as a result of that, it went against whatever the ideology was in China at that time. They gunned him down. They killed him. But it wasn't just him. 200 people died, according to China's government's records. A lot of independent experts reckon that the number of civilians was a lot higher than that. And it probably was. Now, in terms of deaths, that was incredibly high, but even higher, tens of thousands of people were arrested and hundreds of people were also executed and tortured, okay? Now, international responses, straight away, massive problem, people come swooping in. So, in America, they imposed an embargo, suspended high-level contracts and froze new aid to China. So, not only are they trying to, help the people and the families of the victims, but they're now going to be punishing the Chinese government for doing what they actually did. And be like, right, you're not getting any foreign aid from us. That's going to get put on hold. You're not going to get any brand new high-level contracts. That's all now gone. We're going to put an arms embargo on you as well. So you're not going to get any weapons or anything like that. But like what we looked at last week with the import and the export of the different kinds of weapons, and how China was probably the only country that had just as many imports as what it did exports. They might have exported, but they certainly weren't getting anything in. Therefore, they were put that massive constraint was placed upon China. So as I say, it does have a massive, massive impact. The EU did the same, and the World Bank froze $780 million worth of loans to China, and sanctions happened in that respect for well over a year. So a lot of different stuff happens, and as I say, it's so politicised now, because if human rights abuses happen and international social actors want to get involved in preventing these, they're not just going to necessarily punish the country, but as I say, they're going to obviously try their best to make sure that they implement as many positive strategies to prevent this from ever happening again, okay? So if you go to slide 11, this is the response of China, okay? So Japan broke first, they sent foreign aid and renewed trades contract with China, and that buffered against the Western sanctions that we placed upon them. Well, I say we, the US. As time went on, America, they actually found it a lot more difficult to judge China for something that it did years and years and years ago. They basically weren't holding a grudge against them for it. And this had massive economic and political costs for America. Now, it was never really raised as a topic in the United Nations due to the amount of power that China's got. It's known as obviously potentially being one of the biggest superpowers in the world, okay? And this is why, because it wasn't brought to their attention. It wasn't a very small developing country. It was one of the biggest countries in the world who mass-produced probably the most products in the world as well for consumerism. And again, this is one of the reasons why it wasn't brought forward. Now, China lost over 2 years of economic growth at the time, and it really needed it as a consequence of this. And the way in which China responded was it made concessions on political and security matters. So it released people who were detained. They thought, oh, we'll release them. And Chinese leaders and diplomats were shocked by the response and overall by the international criticism. Over 200 people died and thousands of people were tortured and executed. I can't really say how they were shocked, but they were. Now, nowadays, people don't talk about it. It's called the 4th of June event. See what I mean? They put a different name on it and they push it to one side. They'll just sweep that under the carpet because no country ever likes to admit their own faults. This is why in a lot of wars, people don't take full accountability. You know what I mean? Like people will... What's the word I'm thinking of? People will, shoot down a potential terrorist target, but it will be within a massive civilian area. They'll be well and truly aware of what the targets are, but then it will happen anyway because it's for the greater good. And again, because of what happened in China, because they were the ones held accountable and they were named and shamed across the international press, they don't talk about it. If you don't talk about it, it didn't happen. It's that kind of thing. So it's that stigma attached, which is why they don't discuss it. Now, what is really noticeable about the situation in China regarding human rights abuses is that now it is better than what it has ever been before the massacre happened. But what we have to question is this due to the international human rights regime? Is this due to the principles and the norms and the values and everything like that coming into play and then kind of trying to reinvent themselves? Is it because of that? Was it a consequent knock-on effect? It's something that we need to question. So if you go to slide 12, it's about what about non-government organisations, or NGOs for short. So NGOs and NGOs played a really important role in getting human rights into the UN Charter. And some have grown massively in size and influence. So one of the main groups that you probably will all have heard of is Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Now, I know I mention Human Rights Watch all of the time, but it is a really, really good organisation and a fantastic website that you can go on and you can look at all the different reports as well. Now, they use very, very specific techniques, as I've just mentioned. They do naming and shaming, lobbying governments through the size of their membership. They've got people power to make social movements happen. But the non-government organisations, they lack the power of the state and the power of the public opinion. So for the non-government organisations, they're very difficult to mobilise in the same way that NGOs have. Okay. So if you go to slide 13, there's another clip I want you to watch. It's called Introduction to Global Witness. Okay, definitely worth a watch. Please do it. Slide 14. Now, normally in groups, I would say it is, should we use force to push for humanitarian intervention in human rights abusing states? Obviously, you can't do it in groups. So on your own, just write a really short list. It doesn't have to be, like a massive novel. Just 3 or 4 bullet points on each side, pros and cons. Just write a list of the pros and cons in using physical force to intervene. And you can even use like the army as an example. Do you know what I mean? So what effect has the army had on intervening in places such as Iran, in Afghanistan, in Iraq? What effect has that had, positive and negative? You can look at one specific issue of force and then you can weigh up the pros and cons. So if you go to slide 15, what about humanitarian intervention? Now, your normal modern day nation state system is based on rejection of intervention. International law is based around state sovereignty, okay? Now, it's been long recognised that intervention may be justified on humanitarian grounds, but an example of this is that in the Battle of Navarino Bay in 1827, going way back, the British and the French destroyed the Turkish and Egyptian fleets off Greece to support Greek independence. Another example, in 1978, Vietnamese forces invaded Cambodia in order to overthrow one of the main guy's regimes, which during 1975 to 79 caused the death of 3 million people due to famine, civil war and executions. Now, at the time, they weren't obviously seen as humanitarian interventions. That only really started to emerge at the end of the Cold War, when people became very optimistic and they thought, right, okay, we've got a brand new world order. This is the way that it's going to go. We're moving forward. We're being incredibly progressive. Onwards from 1990, this was seen as the golden age of humanitarian intervention. But what I would like to know from you guys is why? Why was it called the golden age of humanitarian intervention? What positive impact did it have in order to make a mass cultural shift and change in the way in which NGOs, people at the UN, what they did in order to intervene? How did it have such a big impact? So if we go to slide 16, the answers. Why intervention in the 1990s onwards? So, number one, humanitarian interests often overlap with the national interests of nation states. And number two, in the world of 24/7 news footage under globalisation, because obviously we know now everything's on the internet, everything's on your telly, it's readily accessible as and when you want it. So we have access to the news because of globalisation, because of the development of the internet, 24/7. Okay. So yeah. In the world of 24/7 news footage under globalisation, governments have come under significant public pressure to act in the event of humanitarian crisis and emergency. So remember the first ever lecture I gave you is about the Rwandan genocide. This has been called the CNN effect. So because there was that much stuff going on in the telly about what was happening in Rwanda, this is why the UN put soldiers in Rwanda. Not very well protected, because all they had on was a little blue beret and that was it. Didn't have guns, knives, nothing. They had absolutely no forms of physically defending themselves. They had no weapons. All they had was their own bodies and that was it. So yeah, they did push forward a human rights intervention and that's great. But what about the people from the UN? Do you know what I mean? Because 12 of the Belgian soldiers, because obviously Belgium colonised Rwanda, 12 of the Belgian soldiers died. And then this happened with all the people from the UN. And because of what was going on and because it was advertised all on the telly, I mean, you can probably ask your parents or grandparents if they remember this. I mean, it was only in the 1990s. So, I mean, to be honest, some of you guys probably will remember seeing this anyway. But yeah, because there was so much pressure from everyone saying, who's going to do something about this? We need to act, we need to intervene. People are dying here left, right and centre. You know, between the Hutus and the Tutsis, people didn't know who was dying because in the end it just became a massive bloodbath and no one took accountability for it. So yeah, that's why it's called the CNN effect. So if something reaches on a mass level and has such a global outreach, people do want to intervene. And this happened when there was the bombing of the Bataclan Theatre, the bomb outside the stadium, all the different shops and things like that in Paris, if you remember a few years ago. This was all over the news for months. Nothing else touched the news channels because this had the CNN effect. It went global. And then therefore every single different kind of government policing teams, obviously you've got like Scotland Yard, and then you've obviously got, you know, like the CIA, MI5, MI6, the FBI, that kind of thing. Everyone wanted to do their bit in order to help stop this from happening going forward. Okay? But that's more, it's not really human rights abusers, but it is obviously a form of terrorism and a form of war, which is why people do obviously want to try and intervene as best as they can. So, number 3, the US emerged as the world's solo superpower, and so they could easily build a consensus amongst other nations. So they had a lot of influence on the way in which other countries thought and felt, and they could push their ideology on other people. That's very important. Now, in the view of the high expectations amongst the public to build a new world order, politicians and policymakers were more likely to accept human rights as more ethical guidelines and for foreign policy, and therefore intervention in other nation states. So if you go to slide 17, but there's always a but, because we always need to criticise stuff. The French intervened in Rwanda just towards the end of that genocide in 1994. They emphasised that it was very strictly humanitarian intervention, where there to help. But was it not because they wanted it for their own self-interests? What investment did they have? Why did they need all these Rwandan people to get along again and to, you know, stop fighting? What self-interest did they have in that? Now, the evidence shows that they were pursuing national interest, and France had propped up the Hutu party for the last 20 years, and they were anxious that actually their interests would decrease if things were to change. So it's a little bit like, you know, people say you don't give to take, but in this case, I think actually they were giving so that they could take and, you know, keep a hold of what their interests were in Rwanda at the time. Now, the RPF, sorry, I'm half asleep today, guys, I'm really sorry. Plus, I haven't got my glasses on. The RPF would win, the Anglophile interests would gain a footing, and they didn't intervene until the end of the genocide. They didn't want to do it in the middle, and they didn't want to do it before, because then that might potentially cause them beef with Belgium, because they were the ones who colonised it in the first place. Now, in 2000, the UN Security Council passed resolutions that instruct UN soldiers to protect endangered civilians using force if necessary, but they weren't given any weapons to use force in Rwanda. Nothing happened because all they had were the blue berets on. So if we go to slide 18, why should we intervene? Now, the legal claim rests on the UN Charter of 1945. And a lot of people would argue that actually there's a right to humanitarian intervention. Everyone has that right within international law, kind of a self-defense mechanism, so to speak. Other people say, as civilians of other countries, we have a moral duty to protect our foreign neighbours, because, we need to stop them from dying as a product of genocide and mass killings. Now, when a state fails to protect the basic right of its citizens, it should lose its sovereignty, and that was set by Tessin in 2003. That's the second point of slide 18. Now, the last point on slide 18 is other points to a very common humanity to protect each other. Like I said, your global neighbour, your friend, we all need to look after each other. We're in this together. And we are very deeply integrated, because it's not just, there is only African people in Africa, there is only French people in France, there is only English people within the UK. That's absolutely not the case. We're a very, very multicultural world that we live in, and people have got interests in other countries because that might be their homeland and not where they're from. And there might be people in power that actually are within one country, but they have family members and friends in another country. So as I say, it doesn't just impact the country that it's happening to, it impacts everybody. So everyone has their own moral, personal, loving form of investment that they have in order to want to protect and put a stop to these human rights abuses. So that's basically why we should intervene. Oh, being devil's advocate, slide 19. Why should we not intervene? Okay. Now, John Stuart Mill said that democracy can only be established by a domestic struggle for liberty. So human rights can't take hold if they're enforced by others. Also, political leaders do not have a moral right to shed the blood of their own citizens to intervene in another nation state. The state, its leaders and its citizens should change things from within. So a little bit like, let's not air our dirty laundry of what's happening in our country to the rest of the world. Let's kind of keep it in-house. So a little bit like what's happening in North Korea. They only have news from North Korea. They don't have access to the internet. It's all kept in-house. And this is why it's really, really difficult, because there is a lot of human rights abuses going on in North Korea. It's just not publicly advertised because we can't see it. We don't have access to North Korea. We don't have access to see what's going on in that country because it's all kept in-house. So that's another reason why, not that we should not intervene, but this is one of the reasons why political leaders feel as though we should maybe not intervene from the actual state that's, persecuting people and abusing people's human rights. Now, nation states always have their own mixed motives for forms of intervention, and they will very, very rarely self-sacrifice their own soldiers unless they have self-interests, such as the Iraq War, for an example. I don't know. So if we go to slide 20, humanitarian intervention in the war on terror. So as I've been discussing this from the beginning, there's been little drips and drabs of talking about war and the war on terror, and this is a lot more in depth in regards to that, okay? Now, before 2001, there was a very firm belief, that we had not intervened enough, should I really say, in global events like genocides, like what happened in Rwanda and the Holocaust, etc. We didn't do enough. Now, after 9/11 happened, Afghanistan and Iraq were, let me rephrase. So this change after 9/11, Afghanistan and Iraq were justified in part on humanitarian grounds, and this led to controversy. So was it to stop future Rwandas or future 9/11s? So what makes me think of that is because in Rwanda, it was a very developing country in Africa, okay? 9/11 happened within, obviously it wasn't just the Twin Towers, stuff happened around all of America on that day, and I must emphasise that. So because the US was such a big superpower at that time, and they became so vulnerable to what happened in America because of this attack by Al-Qaeda, was more attention given to them than what it was in Rwanda. And was that because Rwanda was a developing country and people were more outraged because it wasn't happening in Rwanda? It was happening to, one of the biggest cities on earth, one of the most populous cities on earth, and it was happening to other places in America that really should have potentially been prepared for this kind of impact, when actually it wasn't. So this is why a lot more was done after 9/11, because if a massive superpower country can undergo such a horrific, disgusting attack, then why should we then sit back? Because actually that could happen to the UK, that could happen to somewhere in Eastern Europe, this might happen to Russia. Do you know what I mean? So really, I think that put the question into people's minds that actually, guys, we're all vulnerable here. We need to start doing something, okay? Now, these motives were hidden under the idea that gender emancipation would actually happen to women in Afghanistan and help the Kurdish and Shia populations in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Now, a lot of people have accused neoliberal America and its allies of window dressing their motives to gain new markets. So interventions under the war on terror have caused lots of problems on a mass global scale. And it's actually made it a lot more problematic to mobilise support for humanitarian intervention after 2011. And that's been evident within Burma, Zimbabwe, Sudan. And these states were often practising horrendous human rights abuses, so really, really the most disgusting ones you can possibly think of. If we look at Darfur, 200,000 people died in the region of Sudan, but the UN had given the peacemaking task to a very small African Union force. So there was a lack of finance, a lack of will, a lack of resources, a lack of support from other nation states and the UN as well, to be totally honest. A lot of countries have just stood by and watched. They didn't take action. So they weren't bystanders because they didn't put anything into place. Whereas a bit of bystander intervention is stuff like the HRC, the UN, what they're supposed to be doing. I mean, the UN didn't even really look at LGBT rights up until a few years ago. So what does that tell you? Now, in 2011, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, more commonly known as NATO, intervened in Libya against Colonel Gaddafi. But was that maybe more of an interventionist era for nation states? That's something that I want you to kind of question. And I've got a really lovely quote here from Haywood as well. All right. So there may be little that could be done to alleviate the horrors of Darfur, Burma, Zimbabwe or Syria. From this perspective, humanitarian intervention should be looked at. From the very least, from a long-term perspective, and not become a knee-jerk reaction to humanitarian emergency and growing public pressure for something to be done. Many humanitarian interventions have failed because of inadequate planning for reconstruction and an insufficient provision of resources for rebuilding. So as I've just mentioned there about terms of resources, this is something that actually we need to get more resources out there. We need more foreign aid. We do need to be, physically going into these countries to intervene if it needs it. But at the same time, we also need to include the nation state of where the abuses are happening in order to get the support from every single person involved. Okay, so I'll just do a quick recap of everything that we've discussed. Okay, so human rights frameworks and declarations have given a universal set of norms and values in which to be compassionate and to create feedback mechanisms. So therefore, we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. We're all on the same page. We're all going to go this way for the norms and values. If we all follow it, we'll be fine. And that way, if we need to get any feedback, we've got the feedback mechanisms in place to be able to then get the information to put an action plan in place if needs be. Globalisation has advanced a cosmopolitan vision of global moral interconnectedness. So therefore, people come together. It's a form of very social solidarity. You can look at Emil Durkheim for your stuff on social solidarity as well. There's loads of stuff in the library on the internet for that. So you can get loads of ebooks and stuff if needs be. Now, the growth has not yet been translated into a new international consensus on forcible humanitarian intervention. The UN, their reporting methods carry moral and public weight, but not legal weight. And if you look at the moral rights of someone in comparison with the legal rights of somebody, what is the difference? Well, it's huge. You've got someone's human rights and then you've got what their legal rights are. And actually some of them are very, very different. Not in the UK, but within these development countries, as I mentioned, Zimbabwe, Sudan, a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, these kind of places as well. Civilians are not that well protected because they don't have the rights that we do in the UK. Also look on the role of NGOs and INGOs. They play a massive, massive part in mobilising the public and pressuring governments as well. So they require the assistance of us, the public, to be able to also get ourselves out there in social media, talk about it, write to our local MPs, get other people involved. And as social actors, we are all still social actors. To get everyone involved can help a much more unilateral approach in trying to tackle human rights abuses across the world. The Western public are very sensitive to the human rights suffering of others. Of course we are. We don't see it as much in our country as what other countries do. We take a lot of stuff for granted, but we do have the legislation there to actually protect us. What basic human rights are, what the Equality Act is, all these different pieces of UK legislation, they protect us. But as I say, these other countries don't have that. So because we're so shocked and horrified by what happens in other countries, it pushes us to do something, to make a change, to make a stand. But nation states where it's not happening to them, or nation states where the human rights abuses are going on, a lot of these countries do actually have their own self-interests. France being one of those countries where after the Rwandan genocide they went in. It wasn't because they wanted to necessarily, it was because they had to protect their own self-interests. So again, it's about putting themselves first before these other people. Now, I want to have a really quick chat about assignment 2, okay? I want you to consider the list of questions on slide 23. There's a list of all different questions, okay? I want you to consider all of these different things in terms of your second assignment. It's really important. So once you've watched this video, recap, go back, whatever you need to do, watch the video clips, please watch the video clips. I want you to literally look at each question. I want you to write down your answers as best as you possibly can. Take information from the slides. They're there for a reason. They're there to take notes from. They're there to look at the references. Use them. As I say, they're there as a tool for you guys to help you and assist you with your assignments. So I want you to try and have a think about all the different questions, such as, what about human rights monitoring processes to the United Nations? How have organisations responded to your chosen case study? What has legislation been passed? Look at the legal impact of stuff as well. That's really important. Now, as of tomorrow, I will be, or should I really say today, because it's Thursday today. I'm obviously recording this for tomorrow. Between 10 and 1, or should I really say 10 and half 12-ish? Regardless, I'm available for emails all the way through 10 and 1. Anyone needs a Skype call or they need to have a tutorial with me, please feel free. Just give us a shout and I'll get back to you nice and quick if I can. And obviously go through whatever your concerns and stuff like that are as well. Okay. So that is the end of the lecture. Please all have a really lovely, safe Easter with your families. Take care of yourselves as well. And be safe. Wash your hands. Have a good one. See you later. Bye.